This is A from Estate Diamond Jewelry, and this video is about what is a vintage style ring. At Estate Diamond Jewelry, we've been dealing with vintage engagement rings for over 40 years, and we know very well what a vintage engagement ring. A vintage style ring is a handcrafted engagement ring inspired by the style of a vintage era and set with an antique diamond. So it's made more recently. It's a recent reproduction of an antique ring, and it's set with an antique diamond. The and the styles vary completely. All the different types of styles could be represented, and more often than not, if it's well done, it will look very, very similar to a genuine antique engagement ring. What's the criteria for a ring to be a vintage style engagement ring? Well, firstly, it needs to be handcrafted and not casted. It needs to be created the same way that it was created 100 years ago, the 1920s, 1930s, the Art Deco era. If it was casted and there's hundreds of identical ones, the quality won't be the same. It won't look like the rings that were made 100 years ago, so it won't be called a vintage style engagement ring. It won't be a genuine one. In addition, the center diamond needs to be antique in order to be called a vintage style engagement ring. As you can see over here, it's a small table. There's a culet. There's reflections of the culet. But the center diamond is 100 years old in this ring. The mounting, the setting itself is more recent. The next criteria, of course, is the ring cannot be vintage or antique to be called a vintage style engagement ring, because this is a vintage engagement ring. This ring was actually handcrafted 100 years ago. By the way, all the rings that I'm showing in this video are all available at our website at estatediamondjewelry.com. I also put I'll put links in the description below. Feel free to click on them and take a look. If you have any questions, send them our way. So a vintage engagement ring doesn't actually qualify to be a vintage style ring. And one more criteria is it needs to be inspired by the Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, Art Deco, Art Nouveau, or Retro era. If it's more later, if it's inspired by something later from the 70s or 80s, it's not usually called a vintage style engagement ring. And if it's from something much earlier, like the 2,000 years ago, a Roman historical interpretation of a ring, it's not really called vintage style. That point is historical interpretation. Here are the common characteristics you'll see in a vintage style engagement ring. The first one, as shown in this ring over here, is the mill grain. If you look around the edges and you look around the bezel, you'll notice beads, small little bumps. That's called mill grain. I'll put a link to the article about mill grain below. Take a look at the description. But mill grain is a very common characteristic for vintage style engagement rings. It really just seals the deal. It's very common in vintage rings, and of course it's very common in vintage style rings. Filigree is very characteristic of a vintage style engagement ring. As you can see over here, all the different filigree work. And I'll link to the article on our website, our blog, where we talk about filigree. But all this metal work, it's called filigree, and it's very common in vintage style engagement rings. Another one, antique diamond. The center needs to be antique in order to be called a real vintage style. And over here, you see the small table, you see the culet. This is an antique diamond. For it to be a genuine, a real vintage style, it shouldn't just be the center diamond. Over here, antique cushion cut, that's antique, but even all the side stones, they all need to be antique as well. So as you can see, all these smaller diamonds are all antique. The undergallery, the detailed work underneath the actual main stone, is very common in antique rings and very common in antique style engagement rings. And another very common motif in vintage style rings are two stone types or multiple stone types, not just a plain diamond, but for example, sapphire halo, a ruby halo, accenting emeralds and onyx. All of these are very common in vintage style engagement rings. And the last very common characteristic of a vintage style ring will be a halo, and in the halo itself, different style diamonds and different style themes in the halo, very common with modern day vintage style engagement rings. And that's it. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe to our channel. We're going to be publishing a lot more educational videos about jewelry in general, about vintage jewelry, about diamonds, about engagement rings. Stay tuned.